Day 3. Apurva Satish Amarnath.
Good afternoon, everybody. I am Dr. Apurva Satish Amarnath. I am a consultant in the No IVF Fertility in the Kamanalli branch of Bangalore. And today we'll be covering two topics in this training program for infertility. One is monitoring of an ART cycle, so monitoring of any of the assisted reproductive technology cycles, and luteal support in both ovulation induction and IVF cycles. So I basically would be covering this under the topics of what are the methods of monitoring, the ultrasound and the hormonal evaluation, how they are done, the objectives of monitoring, and the overall conclusion of what needs to be done for monitoring. The methods of monitoring basically would include ultrasound, which which we use for monitoring of the follicular growth and the endometrial thickness. This can be done with the 2D ultrasound, power Doppler imaging also, and a 3D ultrasound. The hormonal test would involve the estradiol levels, the progesterone levels, and an LH level, and finally combining the ultrasound and the estradiol levels. So before we start off about how exactly monitoring needs to be done, let's start off with how a normal ovulatory cycle should look on an ultrasound so that we are familiar with that. So the TVS for a normal ovulatory cycle would basically be a direct observation of a characteristic sequence of changes that occur just prior to and immediately after ovulation. And it basically offers us detailed information about the size and number of the pre-ovulatory follicles, the day of ovulation, and the endometrial thickness at the time of ovulation. So all this information is important for us for predicting the chances of pregnancy in these cycles. So a normal ovary on an ultrasound would basically be an ellipsoid shape, and it is hyperechoic. The differential diagnosis of ovary is cystic mass. The hydrosalpinx also can be seen in that area, and sometimes the bowel also can be mistaken for an ovary. So on day 2, day 3, when we do an ultrasound, the first thing that we look at is the uterus and a postmenstrual or a menstrual endometrium, where the endometrial thickness is very thin. So ideally, we should be seeing a thin endometrium in the menstrual or the postmenstrual phase. A thick endometrium needs to be evaluated at this phase. The second thing that we would be looking at is the ovaries, especially for the antral follicular count. So the antral follicle basically is the one which develops into the follicle and eventually will ovulate. These are sonographically visible. These look like well-defined echo-free cysts with echogenic borders. These are to be measured from the inner diameter to the inner diameter in the greatest diameter. And this usually correlates well with the volume and the endocrine parameters that we would be measuring. So all the follicles that measure anywhere between 2 millimeters to 8 millimeters are to be counted, and that would be the antral follicular count for that particular patient. And the total of both the ovaries, that is, if, for example, if one ovary has 5 and the other has 3, the total antral follicular count for that particular patient would be 8. So some of the things that need to be kept in mind is the pre-ovulatory follicle grows by approximately 2 millimeters per day. The endometrial thickness increases by 1 millimeter per day. And after ovulation, the follicle disappears. The margins begin to appear less distinct, or they're irregular. Internal echoes can appear in what would eventually form the corpus luteum. And there is fluid seen in the cul-de-sac. So in the early proliferative phase, this is how an endometrium would look. There is an echo-free region with a central midline echogenic cavity line that is seen. This is usually a few millimeters in thickness and ideally to be measured about 1 centimeter below the uppermost point of the endometrial stripe from the outer to the outer diameters. Next comes how the dominant follicle would look. A dominant follicle usually appears anywhere between day 8 to day 12, depending on the cycle length of the woman. And any follicle above 14 millimeters is considered a dominant follicle. 1 or 2 follicles usually outgrow the other follicles 4 to 5 days prior to ovulation at the rate of 2 to 3 millimeters per day. They can reach a maximum size of about 20 to 24 millimeters, with the range being anywhere between 18 to 28 millimeters prior to ovulation. So the mid-proliferative endometrium at this stage where the dominant follicle also starts to appear, these are more hypoechoic compared to the myometrium. These are characterized by rim and well-defined boundary in the basal layer and measures about an average from 5 to 8 millimeters. The pre-ovulatory follicles, this is how they look. You can see a hypoechoic structure with well-defined margins. The pre-ovulatory follicle has an inner granulosa cell which becomes crenated 6 to 10 hours before ovulation. A cumulus ophora sometimes can be seen on an ultrasound. This looks like a small echogenic area projecting into the follicle, and it's visible in about 20% of the patients. It confirms the cystic structure to be a mature follicle. So if you do see a cumulus ophorus complex, you can be sure that this is an actual follicle which does contain an oocyte. A late proliferative phase endometrium, this is when it's reaching close to ovulation. It grows by about 1 millimeter per day. These measurements are important because when the endometrium is less than 7 millimeters, the implantation potential is reduced. So the peri-ovulatory endometrium, this is how it looks. A good thick triple line endometrium, at least 7.5 to 8 millimeters in thickness. And sometimes on an ultrasound, you can see a cervical mucus plugs that are seen, which can be seen as a fluid structure in the cervical region. Next, coming to the signs of ovulation. Now, there are multiple ways ovulation is documented. One is there is cystic structure with a variable echo that is seen, which can look like a hemorrhagic cyst. With color Doppler, you will be seeing a good flow around that structure. The other one would be the collapse of the follicle with fluid that is seen in the POD. So this is how it would look: irregular cyst with numerous echoes that can be seen. And this is how a fluid in the cul-de-sac would look. So these are all the signs of ovulation that we look for. And any one of these signs also can be confirmatory that ovulation has probably occurred. So this is another picture of the free fluid. Sometimes instead of fluid in the cul-de-sac, especially if it's an ongoing ovulation or a fresh ovulation, peri-ovarian free fluid can be seen. So that also is a sign of ovulation. Now, following ovulation, most of us don't really monitor all that often, but this is how the structures would look following ovulation. In the early secretory endometrium, that is usually 3 days after ovulation, the basal layer echogenicity increases further. The central line becomes indistinct and it starts to become more homogeneous. There is posterior enhancement seen, and increased secretion of the mucinous material inside the cavity is seen. Next, coming to the mid-secretory endometrium, the echogenicity stays the same, but the endometrium becomes more and more homogeneous. There is an absent central echogenic line at this stage, and the central hypoechoic area becomes more pronounced in this stage. The late secretory endometrium, which could also be the premenstrual endometrium, the thickness and echogenicity decrease slightly. There is posterior enhancement seen on the ultrasound, and central hypoechoic area gradually starts disappearing in this scenario. So the pre-decidual endometrium, the changes of the late secretory enhances. So it becomes less and less echogenic. Central hypoechoic area is absent, and multiple tiny echo-free spaces start to appear, suggesting impending menstruation. So knowing about all this and what happens in a normal cycle, it helps us basically to identify what would happen once we do an ovulation induction. So I will cover this under monitoring in ovulation induction cycle and in IVF cycles. So the basic protocol for an ovulation induction cycle would be we do a day 2, day 3 ultrasound for the woman. This is basically to check for the uterus where the endometrial thickness has to be thin, and to check the antral follicular count in both ovaries and the absence of cyst before we start ovulation induction. Then after that, once medications are started, serial transvaginal sonography for follicular size and endometrium is done starting on day 7. Now, this is again variable depending on the protocol that is being given, but usually we start monitoring around day 10 or day 11. And as the follicular size increases and the endometrium also thickness increases, you would know when to start triggering the patient. So the follicular size, when it is more than 17 millimeters and an endometrial thickness, which is more than 7 millimeters, we can trigger the patient And following this trigger, documentation of ovulation should be done after 36 to 40 hours. This is basically important for us to see if there's any luteal unruptured follicle, because if this is there, then the chances of pregnancy reduces because of lack of ovulation. If the patient is planned for IUI, plan it after about within 36 to 40 hours after the trigger is given. Now, in an ovulation induction cycle, hormonal monitoring has limited role, but it is important to remember that in case you choose to do hormonal monitoring for any reason, like you want to check the risk of hyperstimulation, and measure the E2 you use for that, it can be only done in a CC cycle, that's a clomiphene cycle. In an aromatase inhibitor cycle, the estrogen levels are going to be low, so E2 has no role in an aromatase inhibitor cycle. So only CC if hormonal monitoring is to be done, but ideally we don't really do hormonal monitoring in simple ovulation induction and timed intercourse or IUI cycles. So this is what the protocol would be. So at what point would you think about canceling an IUI cycle? So in an IUI cycle, if we find that there are more than 2 or 3, depending on the protocol that you're looking at, more than 2 or 3 follicles more than 16 millimeters, or more than 1 follicle more than 16, or 2 additional follicles more than 14 millimeters, we have to consider cancelling an IUI cycle. This is basically done not for the risk of hyperstimulation, but it is done for the risk of multiple pregnancies, especially in women with PCOS under the age of 38 without any other infertility factors. Caution is basically indicated if there is rapidly increasing E2 or if there's a high E2 more than 2,500. This would correspond to about 8 to 10 follicles that are being present. So ideally, an IUI should not be done because multifetal gestation becomes much, much more common without really increasing the chances of pregnancy in these cycles. So these would be a criteria for cancellation. So monitoring in an ovulation induction cycle is basically one to see how many follicles are growing, what the endometrial thickness is, whether the ovulation is happening properly or not, and on time or not, and at what point should you cancel an IUI so that the risk of multiple pregnancy and the rare risk of OHSS is also reduced. Next, coming to the monitoring of an IVF cycle. Overall, this is the protocol that we generally follow. A day 2, day 3 ultrasound is done to check for the antral follicular count, to see the ovarian, if there's any presence of any ovarian cysts, and the endometrial thickness. A hormonal analysis can be done at this point on 2nd or 3rd day, an FSH, LH, and an E2 to check for the suitability of starting and also to help decide the dose. In terms of monitoring, the follicular monitoring is done for all the follicles that are growing. So irrespective of their size, ideally they should be documented no matter how big or how small they are, because each of the follicles do contribute to the risk of hyperstimulation. In an antagonist cycle, screen share video. So in an antagonist cycle, ideally what we do usually is 2nd or 3rd day a scan is done, and then we call for them for a scan on day 6, when usually we expect the follicles to be about 14 millimeters in size. And in an antagonist cycle, we start the antagonist at that point where the follicular size is more than 14 millimeters and the estradiol value is more than 250 picograms. So next trigger, we'll have to plan the trigger following that. So the trigger is planned when more than 3 follicles are more than 17 millimeters. The trigger can be either triptorelin, that is the GnRH agonist, or HCG. This would be dependent on the number of follicles that are there. So a GnRH agonist is given in patients who have high risk of ovarian hyperstimulation, and HCG is given in our normal and poor responders. We also do a hormonal assessment on the day of trigger, that is the estradiol and the progesterone values. This is basically to help us decide whether there is risk of OHSS, and the second, whether a fresh embryo transfer is possible, because a high P4 would not allow us to do an embryo transfer. The oocyte retrieval is then planned about 35 hours after the injection. So what are the basic objectives of monitoring in an ART cycle? So the basic reason we are doing monitoring in this format is, one, to predict the ovarian response even prior to starting the stimulation, monitor the effect of pituitary downregulation, especially if you're using an agonist cycle, evaluate whether the dose of gonadotrophins is adequate or not, and to help us decide if we need to increase the dose, decrease the dose, or whether it can stay the same. Prevention of ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, to find the optimal time to give the trigger, and prevention of cycle cancellation. So in terms of monitoring of an IVF cycle, we are looking at how to predict the ovarian response to gonadotrophins. The main aim of monitoring or doing an ultrasound or a hormonal analysis is basically to identify the poor responder and to identify those women who are at high risk of ovarian hyperstimulation. This basically we try to do and look at to choose the optimal starting dose of FSH. So some of the factors that we look at prior to deciding what the dose of FSH or starting of HMG would be, one of the main important determinants is age, then would be BMI, and AFC and AMH. So AFC and the BMI are some of, and the age are the three important factors for us to decide exactly what the dose is. So an AFC count of less than 6 would signify a poor responder who might require a longer duration and a higher dose of gonadotrophins, less oocytes retrieved, and high risk of cycle cancellation before OPU. And anything more than 16 follicles would correspond to a high responder. So looking at an ultrasound, especially on day 2, day 3, and correlating and counting the total number of antral follicular counts, give us a predictive value of exactly how the IVF cycle would go forward. So using age, BMI, and the AMH and the antral follicular levels, we can personalize the treatment. So people with low reserve, the photograph is that of a picomole as per this patient. In India, we do measure at nanograms, so these values might be a bit different. So in patient where the AMH as per our numbers is less than 0.5, you can expect an absent response or a very low response. So in these women, we can use an antagonist cycle or even a modified natural cycle. In women with expected poor response, that is an AMH of less than 1.2, we give a slightly higher dose protocol, that is a GnRH agonist with 300 IU of FSH. In women with normal response, that is AMH between 1.2 to up to 3, we can give an FSH value, FSH of 225, and use both an agonist and an antagonist protocol. In women with polycystic ovaries, that is an AMH of more than 3, we would start with low dose FSH, that is at 150, in an antagonist protocol, and give a GnRH agonist trigger for prevention of hyperstimulation syndrome. So these values are for women who have normal BMIs. So women who have higher BMIs, obviously these the starting dose can increase in these women, and also in women whose age is more, the starting dose can be higher. And vice versa for women who are younger and who have low BMIs too. So the personalization of dose of gonadotrophins would depend on all three factors put together to see which would basically give an optimal response for the couple. So after deciding what the starting dose is, we also need to decide whether, especially in an agonist cycle, whether there is adequate pituitary downregulation. So when some of the factors that we look at for pituitary downregulation is to do a TVS on day 2, day 3, there should be no ovarian cysts, or the size should be less than 8 millimeters, and an endometrial thickness should be less than 6 millimeters. And all these three factors, when they're present, it predicts downregulation in about 95% of the cases. Now we can also do a hormonal assay in these cases where an E2, LH, and a P4 is done. A E2 less than 50 with an LH of less than 5 and a P4 less than 1 nanogram per ml basically lets us know that there is effective pituitary downregulation and we can start the stimulation. In case these values are higher, then the downregulation has to be continued for about 4 to 5 days and then rechecked, and then the stimulation can be started. Next, coming to monitoring the response, one of the important reasons ultrasound is even done is for monitoring the response to stimulation. So for an IUI cycle or an ovulation induction cycle, a TVS on day 10 should ideally show 1 or 2 follicles more than 14 millimeters in size. This basically means that the dominant follicles should be established by then. For an IVF, a basic stimulation should show more than 4 follicles with diameter of at least 11 to 12 millimeters. Now, bear in mind, this means this would be for a normal responder or a hyper responder. People with low response who have less than 4 follicles to begin with, they would not be really fulfilling this criteria. Then for monitoring response, GnR antagonist on a daily basis is to be started with gonadotropin when at least 1 follicle reaches around 13 to 14 millimeters in diameter. The follicular growth and number can be monitored by TVS as and when required. So for monitoring of the response, follow-up needs to be done in serial manner every other day or even daily, depending on the follicular size and the response. Each follicle is measured in at least 2 perpendicular points, and the average of the largest diameters is calculated. The measurement should be done on the internal diameter. So the inner to inner diameter in 2 planes, and the average diameter is calculated. Follicles usually grow by 2 to 3 millimeters in a stimulated cycle in IVF. So if they are not maintaining that velocity of growth and they are growing slowly, it may indicate that either the dose is not sufficient or there is issues with the drug that is being given. So both would have to be checked. So in IVF, we do combine ultrasound and estradiol a lot. But you have to remember that in normal responders, it usually doesn't really change the timing of the HCG or the stimulation protocol. So whether there would be increase in pregnancy rate or the risk of OHSS by combining the two. On day 6, when we do an estradiol, ideally it should be between 300 to 600 picograms. When the E2 is less than 60 picograms per ml, that means there is a very, very low response that is happening, as evidenced by the pregnancy rate, which is 7.8%. And either the dose would have to be increased at this point because there is no sufficient response, or a cycle cancellation would have to be considered. If the E2 is in the optimal range of 300 to 600, then the same dose to continue. If it is lower, the dose to be increased. If it is greater than that, you can consider reducing the dose, but this is usually not done. Keep in mind that patients with PCOD can have much higher estrogen levels on day 6. So that doesn't really warrant a dosage change at this point. It's just that they have too many follicles, so that it is evidenced by the E2 that is there. These protocol would be mainly for normal responders that I'm talking about. Another factor for follow-up of the follicles and the stimulation cycle is color Doppler. It is not really commonly done. We don't do this as a regular for all patients, but it is a factor that can be checked. A significant increased oocyte recovery from follicles with a high peak systolic velocity as measured by pulse Doppler and Grayscale ultrasound basically shows that we have much higher oocyte recovery rate in follicles which are well vascularized. Oocytes from poorly vascularized follicles produce morphologically poor embryos as compared to oocytes from highly vascularized follicles. And follicles with normal perifollicular blood flow contain oocytes free of cytoplasmic or chromosomal spindle defects. High-grade follicular vascularity resulted in oocytes or embryos that had an increased potential for becoming a full-term pregnancy. And quantitative and qualitative assessment of perifollicular flow allow for a more accurate assessment of follicular competence. Follicles that have more than 75% of their surface perfused, or where the peak systolic velocity is more than 10 centimeters per second, it appears to contain an oocyte of satisfactory quality. So what is the role of hormonal tests in an IVF? It is usually done as and when required. Estradiol during monitoring when stimulation response is not adequate, is when we measure a day 5, day 6, and the estrogen value is less than 200 with more than 1 or 2 growing follicles. At this point, either cancel the cycle or look at increasing the dose. On day 10 or day 11 of stimulation, monitoring of each estradiol is done to basically predict the risk of OHSS before the trigger. If the E2 values is more than 2500, give a GnRH agonist trigger with an all-freeze cycle and a frozen embryo transfer to be done at a later date. The other test that is done is basically a progesterone. This is again done before the trigger. This is a predictor of endometrial receptivity. If the P4 is more than 1.5, then given a GnRH agonist trigger can be given. And again, this would entail an all-freeze cycle. Because the progesterone is high and the endometrial receptivity is gone, there's a low chance of pregnancy. So an all-freeze cycle and a transfer at a later date is required. So the next, the next reason that we do a monitoring of an IVF cycle is basically for prevention of hyperstimulation syndrome. So some of the predictors of hyperresponse are: 1, the previous history of OHSS, the presence of polycystic ovaries, younger age of the woman, low BMI, and high AMG. Predictors of high response is ultrasound. So ultrasound showing a PCO pattern of response to gonadotrophins, the number of follicles more than 20, and there is a large number of small and intermediate size follicles, that is 10 to 14 millimeters, which are more than 15. There is lower risk of hyperstimulation when the immature follicles, that is the 10 to 14 millimeter follicles, are less than 15. And the number of immature follicles is more important than the number of mature follicles in predicting OHSS. So a combination of E2 and ultrasound is the best chance of prediction of hyperstimulation syndrome. So this is why it is important that documentation of every single follicle that is growing is important, because a lot of people end up documenting only the dominant follicles or the large size follicles where from which a mature oocyte is expected. But it is equally important in this era that we have to recognize who are at risk of hyperstimulation and prevent it, because there are easy preventable options at this point. So documentation of any and all follicles over 10 to 14 millimeters, and if they are less than 10 millimeters, documentation of the number which are less than 10 needs to be done to decide if there is risk of hyperstimulation. So when that is there, we have to give an agonist trigger. So the value of estrogen in predicting hyperresponse, this again is variable from patient to patient, but general rule of thumb is when there is high or a rapid slope of E2, that is more than 1,000, less than 1,000, there is no risk of OHSS. Again, depends on the number of follicles. Then there is high OHSS that is more than, high E2 that is more than 3,000 to 4,000. HCG2 has to be withheld, and GnRH agonist trigger to be given, that is your decapeptyl or the triptorelin. Less than 3,500, the risk of OHSS is low. Between 3,000 to 5,999, there is a 1.5% chance of risk, and more than 6,000, there is up to 38% chance of risk. There are cases of severe OHSS that are seen even with low E2s, that is 1,500. And a small fraction of the cases will be an excessive E2 slope. That is, the rise of E2 is high, so there is a higher risk of OHSS. So it has to be remembered that E2 cannot be an absolute predictor of hyperstimulation. It is more important that the number of follicles are documented, because we do see it commonly in clinical practice where the E2 is not corresponding to the value of, to the number of follicles that are present. So the ovarian picture should be a deciding factor in deciding what trigger needs to be given, because we are looking at OHSS-free clinics from now on. So after all this, we would have to decide when the optimal time is to give the trigger. So to stimulate ovulation, 35 to 42 hours after the onset of LH surge, it triggers the resumption of meiosis inside the oocyte. So this is what we are trying to mimic when we give a trigger, so that there is a mature oocyte when we do an egg retrieval. So when should a trigger be given? Ideally, more than 3 follicles of greater than 17 millimeter size and endometrial thickness more than 7 millimeters should be a deciding factor for us to trigger during an IVF. And the ovarian follicular aspiration should be planned about 35 to 36 hours after the HCG or the GnRH agonist trigger. So, again, when to trigger is when most of the follicles are large enough to suggest the presence of mature oocytes. Now, especially in women with polycystic ovaries, they usually have discordant growth. So there will be a cohort which is already 18 to 19 millimeters in size, and there will be quite a few which are 14 to 15 millimeters in size. So deciding of the trigger would be basically to, when you see there are enough follicles that are going to give you mature oocytes. So maybe waiting an extra day or two to get the smaller size follicles also big enough is something that can be considered. Optimal oocyte recovery and fertilization rates can be obtained from follicles between 14 to 24 millimeters in diameter, ideally trigger at 17 to 18 millimeters. Oocyte recovery rates start to decrease after the follicles exceed 24 millimeters in diameter, and there is no difference in the oocyte quality obtained from follicles between 18 to 22 millimeters. So it can be more convenient, and predictable planning of oocyte collection can be done when the follicles are in this range. And the oocyte pickup should be done about 35 hours after the HCG. So another factor that we look at is the endometrium, and because that is also an important predictor of the implantation potential. So some of the signs of impaired implantation is an endometrial thickness of less than 7 millimeters, an endometrium volume of less than 2, an endometrial that is too thick also, that is more than 14 millimeters, absence of a multi-layered endometrium, uterine artery PI of more than 3.0, and absence of subendometrial or reduction in the endometrial vascularized area. So presence of all this would also suggest impaired implantation. So it can be considered, it can be looked at to postpone the embryo transfer at this point if any of these endometrial parameters are subnormal. Next, coming to the cycle cancellation in an IVF cycle. This is basically discontinuation of an ovarian stimulation prematurely without oocyte retrieval. The incidence is about 12% of all the IVF cycles which are cancelled before egg collection. So the main reasons for this is no or poor egg production. Patients' personal reasons constitute a small percentage, and other medical illnesses. So low AMH, that is less than 0.4%, had a very high predictive value in cycle cancellation. But some of the indications where we look at cycle cancellation is poor response after 5 days of gonadotrophins. If less than 4 follicles of 10 to 11 millimeters with an E2 value of less than 200 is seen. This is in a normal responder and a hyperresponder. If follicular growth is delayed, that is, stimulation is taking over 10 days. Again, if follicular growth is delayed, where over 10 days you still see less than 3 follicles of about 16 millimeters in size and the E2 is still less than 600, then we consider cancellation of cycle. OHSS is suspected. We don't do this anymore, but at one point in time, OHSS was a reason for cancellation of cycle. Sorry. The basal LH is elevated or a premature LH surge occurs, and an elevated serum progesterone is also detected. We can consider looking at a cycle cancellation, though these are not done anymore because of the freezing protocol is good nowadays. So some of the cancellation rates are dependent mainly on the age of the woman. So the risk of cancellation is low when the woman is less than 35 years, that is between 7.7 to 10%. When the woman is 35 to 37 years, there's a risk of up to 15% of cycle cancellation. Between 38 to 40 years, it's nearly about 20%. And over 40 years, about 25% of the cycles can be cancelled because of low AMH usually. So in conclusion, in terms of monitoring, 2D ultrasound scanning of the follicular size is the method of choice in IUI and IVF cycle, irrespective of which protocol is used. It is the most practical because it gives us the maximum information and it is reliable enough alone for monitoring the ovarian stimulation with gonadotrophins. Combining ultrasound monitoring of follicular size with E2 and P4 is particularly valuable for monitoring poor responders as well as those at risk for hyperstimulation. So this would be about monitoring of your IVF cycle. So monitoring basically is it's an ultrasound guided process for us with addition of the hormones that are done to give us supportive information or just an add-on information. So ultrasound is the mainstay of monitoring for IVF cycles. So next, coming to the luteal support. This is one of the most controversial topics in fertility, basically, because there's absolutely no consensus on use of luteal support in today's day and age. So I'll be covering this topic of, is there any need for support in natural cycle, IUI or IVF cycles? What medication should be given, when it should be given, at what dose it should be given, and the most complicated question to answer of them all is when exactly should we stop luteal support? So luteal support in a natural cycle is basically the time between ovulation and either pregnancy or menstruation occurs. That's when it's given. So LH is the hormone which supports the corpus luteum and stimulates progesterone production. In ovulatory women, 92% of the cycles show normal luteal function, and luteal support is usually unnecessary. So any treatment that is being done in a natural cycle, which could be an IUI or even just timed intercourse, separate luteal support doesn't really need to be given. So sometimes a natural cycle IUI is done, like in donor insemination or cervical factor infertility and very mild male factor infertility. Again, since it's a natural cycle, luteal support is unnecessary and increases the cost of the cycle without increasing the pregnancy rate. So not really recommended. So what happens? So that's what happens in a natural cycle. So in case of a stimulated cycle, this doesn't really hold good because there is a lot of changes that is brought about because of the stimulation that is happening. So what happens is multiple follicles of different sizes might ovulate at different times and it expands the fertilization window. Thus, both the estrogen and progesterone after multiple ovulation is expected to be significantly higher. And these high concentration may not only influence the receptivity of the endometrium, but may also cause luteal insufficiency and early luteolysis. So because of all these causes, luteal support is required in stimulated cycles. So what happens, we'll start off with ovulation induction cycles. This could be timed intercourse or in IUI cycles. So in clomiphene citrate stimulated cycles, as per these papers published way back in 1984 and 1989, it shows that luteal inadequacy may be seen in up to 50% of CC cycles in anovulatory women. See.
Hello? Hello? Hello?
Hello.
Hello? Hello? Hello?
So in ovulation induction cycle, in CC stimulated cycles, up to 50% of CC induced cycles in anovulatory women have luteal insufficiency. This is another paper. It showed in CC stimulated cycles, there is no difference in ongoing between patients who did or did not receive vaginal progesterone as luteal support. That is 8.7% in women who did not receive versus 9.3% in women who did receive luteal support. Thus, routine supplementation of the luteal phase with vaginal progesterone does not seem to improve the pregnancy rates in normo-ovulatory women stimulated with CC for IUI. So this is as per this particular.
Hello, Dr. Apurva. Hello.
Yes, ma'am.
Hello.
Hello.
Dr. Apurva, I'm Harini here. Dr. Harini
Yes,
here.
ma'am. Yes,
Which one
ma'am.
will be better? Vaginal progesterone will be better for continuation of the pregnancy, or for a luteal support, or gel will be better?
Ma'am, at this current consensus is that none of the progesterones are superior compared to the others. So any of the progesterones that the patient is comfortable with and the clinician is comfortable with can be continued for the patient.
Okay, but basically they say that vaginal will be better than the oral, right? Progesterone. Hello.
Yes, ma'am. So in the progesterones, vaginal, intramuscular, and dydrogesterone, all three of them have similar activity. Oral use of micronized progesterone, that is your natural progesterone, that has much lesser pregnancy rates. So you can use vaginal or any mode of vaginal or intramuscular or dydrogesterone can be used. The micronized progesterone orally does have a lesser pregnancy rate, ma'am.
Okay, but these are oil-based injections, no? Very painful, don't you think?
Yes,
injections. So it is
Yes,
better
ma'am.
to go for a vaginal, right?
Yes, ma'am, preferably.
Yeah. Thank you, Apurva.
Yes, ma'am.
Inform them at the last.
I'll be taking questions at the end of the session. A lot of your doubts might be cleared at this phase itself. So in ovulation induction cycles per se, where we are looking at timed intercourse or IUIs, it is seen that shortened luteal phase is seen in about 20% of cycles with FSH stimulation or a HMD stimulation. And in a recent meta-analysis, it is shown that luteal phase support with progesterone improves the success in FSH cycles, but not in CC-induced cycles. So overall, luteal phase after ovulation induction, progesterone support may be of benefit to patients undergoing ovulation induction with gonadotrophins in IUI cycles. Progesterone did not support, progesterone support did not benefit patients undergoing ovulation induction with CC, suggesting a potential difference in the endogenous luteal phase function depending on the method of ovulation induction. So in ovulation induction with IUI, progesterone is absolutely not required as per these papers, but most of us do give one mode of progesterone in ovulation induction cycles. So next, coming to luteal phase defect in IVF. This is basically seen because there is supraphysiological steroid concentration secreted by multiple corporal lutea, which directly inhibit LH release. HCG for the final oocyte maturation suppresses the endogenous LH production. A gonadotrophin agonist or antagonist for downregulation prevents the LH rise. And removal of large quantities of granulosa cells during oocyte retrieval contribute to the luteal phase defects in IVF, which is why luteal support is required in most cases of IVF. It depends on the stimulation protocols also. In patients who are undergoing GnRH agonist or antagonist protocols, luteal support is required. In women who are undergoing IVF use for a mild stimulation protocol where clomiphene citrate with gonadotrophins only is given, luteal support may or may not be given. So what are the common luteal support protocols that are used? One is the HCG. Second is the progesterone, which is the most commonly used one. HCG and progesterone as a combination. GnRH agonist, which is starting to be newly used, and the estradiol. So we'll cover each of these. HCG, when given as luteal support, the first dose is for ovulation induction or your trigger injection, which is at 5,000 to 10,000 international units if urinary is used, and between 250 to 500 micrograms if recombinant is used, and a dose of 2,000 to 5,000 international units for luteal support every 3 to 4 days is given for a HCG. This basically stimulates the corpus luteum, leading to formation of other factors. That's basically the estrogen and progesterone to support the pregnancy. So the advantages of use of HCG is that it is convenient. It just has to be given every couple of days. The disadvantages is especially in women with high risk of OHSS who have a lot of eggs and high estradiol. It would worsen the symptoms. And it also interferes with the pregnancy test because a patient who's taking HCG every 3 to 4 days, a urine pregnancy test or a beta HCG will come positive. Next, coming to the progesterones. Natural progesterones usually are rapidly metabolized after oral administration, and synthetic progesterones also would be available, which resist enzymatic digestion, adverse effects on lipids, but they can be teratogenic if androgenic. So most of the time we do use natural progesterones in IVF. So progesterones can be given in multiple routes. The commonly used routes are intramuscular, that is 50 to 100 milligram daily. Oral doses of 600 to 800 milligram daily. This is if natural progesterone is used. In case of dydrogesterone, it is between 20 to 30 milligram daily. Intravaginal doses is 600 to 800 milligram capsules or 8% gel daily in a 90 milligram dose. So natural progesterone, in terms, if oral route is used, micronized progesterone is what is available. This improves the absorption and bioavailability. It is also rapidly metabolized, so it is rapidly cleared from the circulation during first hepatic pass. So the maximum plasma concentration is reached within 4 hours. The only place it is really used is only because it is convenient. 600 to 800 milligram per day in 2 to 3 doses, but it's never used as a single route. It has shown reduced implantation rates when compared with HCG, intramuscular, and vaginal progesterone. It has poor bioavailability due to rapid hepatic metabolism. There is failure to induce uniform secretory changes in the endometrium. And the metabolites of natural progesterone do induce significant sedative and hypnotic effects. So the side effects of this would be drowsiness, nausea, flushing, and fluid retention. Due to all these effects, oral route is not really preferred for luteal support in any of the cycles, either ovulation induction or an IVF cycle. Next, coming to the intramuscular route, this is one of the commonly used methods of giving progesterone. So there's daily injections of 50 to 100 milligram that is given. The disadvantage of giving an intramuscular progesterone is it causes marked inflammation at the injection site. There could be redness, pain, and sterile abscess that happens. It is also rapidly absorbed, so high plasma concentrations are reached within 2 hours, and it leads to a more sustained effect due to depot effect. So intramuscular route, if it is being used, especially prior to embryo transfer, it needs to be given as a daily dose. In case you are combining IM progesterone with other progesterones, especially after embryo transfer, it can be given every 2 to 3 days, so that the depot effect does take care of the progesterone, especially when it's used in combination with others. Now, there are other preparations of injectable progesterones. Subcutaneous is produced. This is not an oil-based, this is an aqueous progesterone. It can be used in the dose of 25 to 50 milligram daily. And this has significantly less pain compared to the intramuscular oil-based injection. Next, coming to the vaginal route, this is the most commonly used method of giving progesterone to women who are undergoing assisted reproductive technology. This is basically because the vaginal mucosa rapidly absorbs progesterone and has reservoir effect. The absorption is enhanced by estrogenization, and absorption is also influenced by form. So tablet, suppository, oil-based solution, all of them have different absorption rates. So the advantages of using vaginal route is it avoids the first pass metabolism in the liver. There is sustained plasma concentration. Maximum concentration is reached at 3 to 8 hours depending on the formulation, but a higher dose is required compared to the IM route, and it has similar pregnancy rates as intramuscular route. The side effects of the vaginal progesterone is basically discharge and irritation. So this can happen again depending on the type of progesterone formulation. There is differing rates of irritation. So with tablets, it is about 6%, which is with the capsules, it's at about 14%. Suppositories up to 30%. So this can affect the patient's comfort and compliance during an IVF treatment. So the most common reason for discontinuing the progesterone is basically the irritation that it causes. So other methods of giving progesterone might have to be supplemented. Next, coming to the dydrogesterone, this is a drug which is structurally and pharmacologically similar to natural progesterone and has good oral bioavailability. It has a good safety and tolerability profile and has no androgenic effects on the fetus as is seen now. If it is used alone, it should be used at the dose of 30 milligram per day. The current Lotus trial is one looking at that. It is seen that the pregnancy rates between the modes of treatment, that is vaginal progesterone versus IM versus dydrogesterone, is similar. Next, coming to the GnRH agonist. GnRH agonist in the luteal phase in an IUI cycle or even in an IVF cycle. This is one of the new luteal support that is seen, which may act at different levels, including the pituitary gonadotrophin. It is said to increase the LH levels, the endometrium, and even the embryo itself. The regimens that are used are a single dose of triptorelin 6 days after ovulation, or 3 doses of leupride on consequent days, 6th day, 7th day, and 8th day after ovulation. So there was a paper on the evaluation of the impact of gonadotrophin releasing hormone agonist as an adjuvant in luteal support. The conclusion was that 3 1 milligram doses of leupride administration 6 days after oocyte retrieval in the long protocol does not really result in an increase in the ongoing pregnancy rates. So this was a paper that was published in 2012. There was a meta-analysis that was published in 2010. This is based on the administration of a single-dose GnRH agonist in the luteal phase in ICSI cycles. So the mechanism is GnRH agonist can collaborate in the corpus luteum function, acting directly on the endometrium via local receptors, a direct effect on the embryos, or a combination of all of these. So GnRH administration can improve clinical outcomes, but right now there is no consensus on use of it because we don't know whether it is superior to the drugs that is already being used, and there is a lot of heterogeneity in the trials that are using the GnRH agonist, so there is no consensus at this point. Next, coming to the HCG versus progesterone. Using HCG alone or in combination with progesterone doesn't really improve the pregnancy rates or miscarriage rates. And the disadvantage of using HCG is the risk of OHSS is significantly higher in treatments involving HCG rather than with progesterone alone. So presently, the only place where HCG is given in luteal support is if a fresh transfer is being tried in women who are given a GnRH agonist trigger in women with risk of OHSS. So since we are looking at OHSS-free clinics, this is not really recommended. This is the only place it is being currently used. Next, coming to estradiol valerate. The role is not very clear of exactly whether we need to use estradiol valerate in everybody. This is usually used in a donor recipient or a frozen embryo transfer cycles for growing the endometrium. 6 to 12 milligram per day is used for endometrial development. It's usually combined with progesterone following the embryo transfer. So there are multiple papers that have been published in terms of estrogen. So one that was published in 2008 in Fertility Sterility was the use of estradiol for luteal support in IVF ICSI cycles. This was a meta-analysis. This was done on a cycle of agonist cycles and not the antagonist cycle. It showed that addition of E2 to P4 for luteal support in ICSI IVF cycles has no additional benefit on pregnancy rates. There was another paper that was published which showed that luteal support with estrogen in addition to progesterone increases pregnancy rates in IVF cycles with poor response to gonadotropins. So there are multiple papers which show that there is improvement in pregnancy rates, and there are multiple papers which show there is no change in pregnancy rates with addition of estrogen. So this is still a controversial topic. So the next controversy is actually when exactly should we even start luteal support. So there's multiple schools of thought where it is said that you should start luteal support on the day of pickup, one day after the OPU, 2 days after the OPU, and there are also some schools of thought which look at beginning of the luteal support just one day before the egg pickup is done. So at this point, there is no consensus on when exactly it needs to be done. Most of us do start luteal support on the day of egg pickup itself, but it has been found that there is no difference in the outcomes when the luteal support is started on the day of pickup versus even day 4 following the egg retrieval. So the effect of inducing dose of HCG remains for at least 4 days. So that would cover the luteal support in the first 4 days, beyond which luteal support would be required. So the duration of luteal support, it usually is given initially for 14 days when pregnancy test is carried out. And if pregnant, it can be continued up to 12 to 14 weeks of gestation when adequate placental function is established and is completely taken over by the placenta. So that is the usual protocol that is followed, but there is absolutely no consensus in when exactly it needs to be started and stopped. And the biggest confusion is when exactly it's to be stopped, because there are multiple papers which say that you can stop at the start of beta HCG. There are papers which say to continue till the cardiac activity appears, and there are papers which say that you continue till the placental support is taken over completely in the body. So there is absolutely no consensus on when exactly it needs to be stopped. There is enough supporting evidence for all of them, saying you can even stop at once the beta HCG is positive, versus papers which say continue till 12 weeks. So these are some papers which show stopping the luteal support a little early. So there, as you can see in almost all the papers, there is hardly any difference between pregnancy rate where the luteal support is extended anywhere between 8 to 10 weeks versus stopping at the pregnancy positive or where the cardiac activity has just appeared. So there is no consensus on when exactly it needs to be continued and stopped, but the usual practice is to continue at least from 9 to 12 weeks following the embryo transfer. So there are other medications that are used in luteal support, that is aspirin, heparin, steroids, and sildenafil. Aspirin and heparin, the only role is in women who have thrombophilias. There's no role for steroids and sildenafil in luteal support as such. So the conclusion of luteal support is, as you can see regarding everything that we have spoken about, there is no uniform approach to the luteal phase, and this is as per the World Collaborative Report on IVF in 2001. So the reason why we would require a luteal support is ovarian stimulation basically destroys luteal phase function, the hormonal levels, and the endometrial behavior. So some of the common luteal supplementation is progesterone supplementation. It is vaginal or intramuscular, that is 600 to 800 milligram vaginally or 100 milligram intramuscularly. It's usually given from egg pickup to at least the presence of a heartbeat. There is no need for estimating serum levels of progesterone before starting it, and estrogen can be used along with progesterone. The role of GnRH agonist is controversial, and heparin and prednisolone in recurrent IVF failure or recurrent abortions is only there, but again, if there is absolute indications for its use. These are the two topics in terms of monitoring of an IVF cycle and the luteal support. Luteal support is still a highly controversial topic. So I would invite you for questions right now. So there are some questions that we need to clear now. How to manage thickened endometrium on a baseline scan? So there are a few ways to manage that. One is whether you'll have to monitor if a thick endometrium is a constant that is seen always for the woman. The first thing that you need to rule out is whether she's not yet even started menstruating in the first place. So if she's not started menstruating, she has to first wait for a few more days to see if a cycle is coming. The second would be these are women who can have endometrial hyperplasias. So an endometrial biopsy to be done in women in the OPD itself, and maybe 2 to 3 cycles, depending on the report, of Primolute to be given. Primolute in the sense progesterone to be given to suppress the endometrium. And following that, by repeat biopsy, especially if there was a problem seen in the first biopsy, and then plan an ovulation induction, because a thick endometrium also is going to impair implantation.
Hello, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Hello. Thin endometrium, basically we should look for the TB, tuberculosis of the endometrium, TB PCR.
Ma'am, in terms of monitoring on day 2, day 3, all that we are looking is for a thin endometrium. The other causes, if thin endometrium are asking in the late proliferative phase, is what you're looking at. Yes, TB endometrium has to be looked at. And ideally, the gold standard for diagnosis is a culture. So we'll have to do a biopsy and a culture for this. We can do a TB PCR just as an initial treatment, but confirmation has to be done with a AFB culture. So thin endometrium, that is one of the causes. The other cause we need to rule out is if there is any other infections. There could be endometritis or even Asherman syndrome with thin endometrium. So those also need to be ruled out. So thin endometrium can be checked in 2 ways. One is you can give them a HRT treatment, basically giving them estradiol high dose to see if they're growing the lining. The other would be to do a hysteroscopy to rule out any structural anomalies, and also to do a biopsy also at the same time. So these are to be looked for if there's thin endometrium, ma'am.
This tuberculosis of the endometrium, when are we supposed to send the endometrium for TB, PCR and culture?
Culture can be done at any time, ma'am. Histopathology, it has to be sent in a premenstrual endometrium. And a TB PCR also can be sent at any time of the cycle.
Not during the menstruation, within 6 hours of the menstruation? That
no, ma'am. It's not specific or particular like that. Only for histopathology, it is probably a day or 2 prior to the expected menstruation.
Okay.
Then there's a question on, is sildenafil really helpful in improving blood circulation to the endometrium and in implantation? And there are very few studies which actually show that it is absolutely useful. Sildenafil is said to improve the vascularity. It is started usually on day 3 and continued up to the embryo transfer. Now, sildenafil is said to improve the endometrium, but only vascularity, whether it absolutely improves, because it's never used as a single structure. It is never used as a single drug. We do use it as a combination with multiple this one. So sildenafil as such, as per current papers, it is not absolutely shown to improve the circulation or improve pregnancy and implantation rates. So we don't very commonly use it unless there's no other options left. So there's a question from Dr. Chaitra here. It says, if warranted, when to start luteal support in a CC cycle? So if you feel like you want to give luteal support in a CC cycle or any ovulation induction cycle that you are planning, it is important that you look at whether ovulation has happened or not. So it is very important that you document ovulation, and following ovulation, you can start the luteal support for about 2 weeks till the pregnancy test is done. This is basically to make sure that luteal support is not started prematurely, and the endometrium and the embryo, there should not be any asynchrony. So document ovulation as per the as per ultrasound, following which you can start the luteal support. And usually only progesterone, one method of progesterone, either vaginal or maybe a dydrogesterone, is usually sufficient for luteal support in CC cycles. So sildenafil versus Proguanova, as per Dr. Sahana, I'm assuming this is for a thin endometrium. So sildenafil, Proguanova is basically estradiol valrate. Usually in thin endometrium, we go into a higher dose up to 12 milligram of estradiol in women with thin endometrium. And in sildenafil, we can give up to 25 to 50 milligrams per day. Because the mechanisms of action are different, usually Proganova and sildenafil are combined in case of thin endometrium. So one is not really superior to the other. Proganova has more, what do you say? There are more studies showing it is more effective compared to sildenafil at this point. Role of Proluton in early pregnancy support. Usually at this point, there is no role of progesterones as such in pregnancy support in women who have normal pregnancies. We only advocate luteal support in women who have assisted cycles because of the luteal function that is compromised in them because of either we're removing a lot of granulosa cells during pickup, or because of supranormal hormone levels where there is downregulation happening in the body. So there's no actual role of giving Proluton in early pregnancy, especially in a normal pregnancy. And addition of a progesterone, especially in IVF pregnancies where usually they are already given 2 to 3 methods of progesterone, doesn't really change the outcome. Does anyone else have any other questions? So if there's no further questions at this point, we are always free to reach out to me directly. Okay, there's another question here. So progesterone support is only till UPT positive. Like I covered in the topic itself, there is multiple reasons for multiple times where we give progesterone. And there are a lot of studies which show that up to UPT positive is sufficient for progesterone support, and anything above and beyond that is not usually required. But what is generally done is, especially if luteal support is started, is we continue giving luteal support until there is overlap of the placenta which takes over the function. So that's usually till 7 to 9 weeks. But there are enough and more papers which say up to UPT positive is sufficient and the corpus luteum will take over. But this has to be remembered that progesterone support given in agonist cycles where HCG trigger is given and there is the corpus luteum is sufficient to UPT positive. But in women who have undergone a frozen embryo transfer or a donor cycle transfer, they would still require a little bit of extended luteal support because there is no corpus luteum that is there. So there's another question is how do you assess the subendometrial vascularity or volume of the endometrial cavity after? So in view of subendometrial vascularity, all you have to do is look at it through the color Doppler mode. You will be able to see multiple vascular stubs that is seen throughout the endometrium. So there is a grading system of grade 1, 2, and zone 1, 2, and 3 of the endometrium. So the outermost, that is near the myometrium, closer to the myometrium, is zone 1 vascularity, and towards the central line of the triple line, that is zone 3. So ideally, you should be seeing vascularity in all 3 zones. That mentions that there is good vascularity. Now, volume of the endometrial cavity is a specific function of 3D ultrasound. So you can only check it if you have the 3D ultrasound function in the scan machine that you have. So there is a endometrial volume that it can be calculated on that, and that gives you a calculation of the endometrial volume. So that should be more than 2 cc for us to say that's a good chance of pregnancy. It's not absolutely required in every person to be done. So it's usually an endometrial thickness along with the subendometrial vascularity is sufficient to give us the prognosis for the patient. So another question is, after HCG for ovulation, sometimes follicle increase in size. So how do you confirm ovulation for IUI? So sometimes this does happen quite often actually. After giving HCG, there is still no ovulation that is seen and follicular increase is seen. So this you need to consider as a luteal unruptured follicle, because if the follicle size increases with no internal echoes, which means that it has converted to a corpus luteum and there's no fluid seen, it means that there is no ovulation that has happened. So the couple has to be counseled that there is no ovulation that has happened, and when there is no ovulation that has happened, the chances of pregnancy is lower. So the one way to look at it is whether the drug was given properly or whether the drug was stored properly in the first place. And the second would be if HCG was given properly and the drug is acting properly, then you can probably look at using a GnRH agonist trigger in a subsequent cycle to see if there's any changes. If the luteal unruptured follicle syndrome continues to stay that way and it is persistent, then they would require an IVF for treatment, because without ovulation happening with these drugs, there's no chance of pregnancy. There is one more question. In a patient with hypogonadotrophic hypogonadism who's on gonadotrophin stimulation, should we supplement both E2 and P4 in luteal phase? In patients with hypogonadotrophic hypogonadism, yes, there is supplementation required, because even though there would be corpus luteum after ovulation, there is still no production of endogenous FSH or LH that is happening on the corpus luteum to produce E2 and P4. So in patients with hypogonadism, till the placenta takes over, so at least till 7 to 9 weeks, E2 and P4 should be continued in the luteal phase.
Hello, Dopplers have any role, Apurva?
In which month?
Like in IUI and IVF?
Dopplers actually is not done as a routine for everybody. It's more of a prognostic indicator, especially in women who've had previous cycles with either no pregnancies happening, especially in IVF, where we've had difficulty in retrieving the number of follicles that were expected. So we can check the perifollicular growth. I mean, perifollicular Dopplers, and check whether there is good vascularity. So ideally, there should be at least 75% of the capsule to be vascularized with a peak systolic velocity of 10 centimeters. But checking it for each follicle at every visit becomes a cumbersome process. So usually it is done in women who are usually under experiments or trials. It's not done as usual in clinical practice now. There's another question of how long to continue hormone support in IVF cycles after fetal cardiac activity is seen. Like I've covered, there is no consensus on this. Usually, there are papers which say that either the UPT positive or once the cardiac activity has appeared, the progesterone can be stopped because the placenta would have started producing. But the usual practice is we continue up to at least 7 to 9 weeks and generally up to 12 weeks so that until the placenta completely takes over, there is luteal support that is given from the outside. So, Dr. Jaljakshi, there is no absolute consensus at this point. So most people continue till 12 weeks, but I would suggest probably up to 7 to 9 weeks, especially in frozen embryo transfer cycles, to be continued because there's no corpus luteum in these women. In patients who have undergone a fresh cycle, it can actually be stopped after fetal cardiac activity without making any changes in the outcomes. But in women with frozen transfer cycles and with who are donor recipient cycles would require luteal support till the placenta takes over.
Okay, I have one case. Hello.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
That is what husband is HIV positive. The
Okay.
wife is negative. Okay. Hello.
Yes, ma'am.
Husband is HIV positive.
Ma'am, your voice is cutting.
I think you-
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
So in that case, how are we supposed to go ahead? IUI, is it?
In this case, ma'am, there are two options to be given to the patient. The first thing that they have to be counseled is because they are serodiscordant, even with IUI, there is a risk of transmission. So we'd have to do a double wash for this particular couple and go ahead with an IUI if they are okay with the small risk of transmission of
Okay.
HIV. The second option to be offered to them is to use a donor sample itself and do a donor IUI if they don't want to take the risk of transmission at all. It also depends on his viral load and his CD4 counts at that particular point and how long he has been on ART treatment. So all of that will factor in, and whether we can even do an IUI in terms of a HIV serodiscordant couple, or whether it has to be done, whether they have to directly do a donor cycle. It depends on that, ma'am.
Okay. ICSI will be better for this, or double wash IUI?
ICSI has a lower rate of
Sperm will
transmission,
get,
ma'am,
you
in
see.
HIV. ICSI has a lower rate of transmission because there is no semen that is transferred. It's basically the semen which basically transmits the HIV. So in IUI,
Okay.
though the double wash reduces the risk, the total amount of semen transferred, it doesn't eliminate it completely. In an ICSI cycle, what we do, since we are directly injecting the sperm, there is no contamination of the semen that happens. So an ICSI cycle would be better for them.
Okay. When you when you get a case of ovarian cyst that is the lesser than 5 centimeter, like follicular cyst on the second day of the period, apart
Yes,
from giving OC pills, can we proceed with the IUI? Any other method we have?
In case of a persistent follicular cyst, usually 1 or 2 cycles, if you wait, it reduces and it disappears. In case you do want to start a stimulation, I would suggest do a hormonal analysis. You need to see an FSH and an E2. If they are normal, E2 and a progesterone also. If these are normal, then you can still go ahead with an IUI. But if these are high, in the sense your FSH is low, your estrogen is high, and your progesterone is more than 1, then I would suggest not to start in that cycle because it's already hormonally challenged at that point. So there's another question saying regarding the serodiscordancy in HbSAg positive couple. HbSAg positive as such, if ideally before we start treatment in a serodiscordant HbSAg positive couple, the first thing we need to do is get the wife vaccinated. This is assuming the husband is positive. So once vaccination is given, we can do an IUI or an IVF. It doesn't really help. It doesn't really transmit that way. So it is not the same in a HbSAg positive like in HIV. So in a HIV serodiscordancy, we would have to do a double wash IUI, and ICSI would be preferable, and or using a donor directly. But in a HbSAg, that doesn't really need to be done. The only thing that we need to ensure is the wife is vaccinated prior to starting the treatment. Does anyone else have any other further questions?
See,
Hello?
if you try good. Hello.
Hello?
Apurva, can you hear? Hello. Can you
Yes,
hear
ma'am.
me?
Yes,
Yeah,
ma'am.
you use the protocol of for IUI letters with the what is your HMG or FSH, and for
Yes,
the two
ma'am.
good size is good. But in spite of that, your UPT comes negative.
Okay.
Hello,
This
how
is
to
for
go
IUI
about this?
cycle.
IUI, how
Ma'am,
to go
the first
about the
thing that has to be remembered in an ovulation induction with an IUI cycle is the pregnancy rates are only between 15 to 18%, even in the gonadotropin cycles. So usually in women who are having difficulty in conception with ovulation induction and IUI are women who have micro defects in fertilization. So most of these women, especially the unexplained category, unexplained infertility category, they usually have fertilization defects. So the treatment of choice for these couples, after especially if there are 3 cycles of IUI that are failed, is an IVF. Now, in terms of modification of IUI protocols, uh, the protocol should be such that we get 2 to 3 optimum size follicles to improve the chances of pregnancy. So, combining letrozole and gonadotropins does improve that in terms of getting the follicular size, and also the trigger should be given ideally at more than 8 millimeters in size. So, all of this will improve the chances of pregnancy. In spite of that, when pregnancy is not happening, then ICSI is the treatment of choice for them. There's
There's no
another
need to
question.
change.
No, ma'am. If she is ovulating properly and she's developing 2 to 3 follicles, there's no
Yeah.
need to change the protocol.
Okay.
That can continue the same way.
Yeah.
There's another question here. Hyperviscosity in semen analysis other than IUI, any medication will help. One of the most common causes of hyperviscosity is infection. So the first thing to do is either do a semen culture and to see if there's any growth, or empirical treatment with doxycycline 100 milligram for a 14 to 21 days is given to reduce the infection, following which treatment can be given. So hyperviscosity, the common, if the infection is the cause, this will take care of it. Otherwise, an IUI would have to be done.
Hello,
Hello.
madam.
Yes.
There are 3 abortions in a woman for the husband with it. But with all the investigations, it has not again can the donor semen be used in those such cases?
And the husband has a male factor, ma'am. Hello. Hello, ma'am. Your voice is very low. I'm not able to hear you.
He has got 3 repeated abortions.
Okay, ma'am.
Other than it's a normal apla
Okay.
and fetus like can the donor semen be used in such cases?
Ma'am, it depends on what the cause of recurrent abortions is. If it is a male factor, severe male factor that is seen, donor semen can be used, but only changing the sperm may not be useful if there is no male factor that is seen. So in terms of male factor, there are two causes which really cause recurrent abortions. One is if the quality itself is very poor, so where the number, concentration, and then morphology is very low. Another is the sperm DNA fragmentation is high. So there's a lot of DNA defects that are seen in these women. So if the DFI is high, then again the risk of miscarriage is also higher in these women. So in that case, there are two options. One is we do something called MAX, that is the magnetic assisted cell sorting on the semen, and plan an IUI, or an IVF has to be planned. If it is severe male factor that is causing, a donor sperm can be used. In terms of recurrent abortions, otherwise, the other options that are there, if all these reports are normal, because most of the causes of abortion is genetic in terms of the embryo, we can offer something called a pre-implantation genetic screening, where we create the embryos, test the embryos to see if they're genetically normal, and only if they're normal to do an embryo transfer. So that is an option available to them if they want to use that, ma'am.
What are the drugs to improve the morphology of the sperm?
Morphology of the drug of the sperm is very difficult to be improved with medication. In most of the time, it is lifestyle related, which is causing these issues. And sometimes it can be genetic issues itself. So the best thing to do in terms of increasing morphology is to improve the lifestyle. That is reducing the smoking, alcohol intake, environmental exposure to a lot of pollution, reducing the temperature. The medications, there are medications to help improve concentration and motility. Morphology is very difficult to be corrected in this medication. So antioxidant medication can be used for improving the motility. But morphology is something that is inherent in the man. So unless it is only lifestyle factors which is affecting, improving the morphology of the sperm is very difficult.
Hello.
Yes, ma'am.
Hello.
Yes,
The morphology when it is less, if it is 2%, should we
yes.
go for DNA fragmentation index? Hello.
Ma'am, DNA fragmentation index is not only morphology. If it's a combination of low motility and morphology, then DNA fragmentation index can be done. The thing
Then
is,
when should we ask for Y chromosome deletion test?
a Y chromosome deletion test is to be asked for only when there's azoospermia, ma'am.
Okay. Otherwise, if there
Otherwise,
is
it's not really required.
morphology, it's
No, not for morphology, it's not required. Y chromosome microdeletions is seen in about 10% of patients of azoospermia. So it doesn't really make sense to do it in patients who have sperm production. Because if there's the AZFC mutations are present, then there's going to be azoospermia and not low counts. Low counts are usually because of other factors like childhood infections or trauma or even obstruction that is seen unilaterally sometimes. So those cause. So those are most structural and developmental, this one that is seen. Genetic is usually for azoospermia.
it is non-obstructive azoospermia, we should ask for Y
Yes,
chromosome
ma'am.
deletion.
Yes, ma'am.
Oh,
So in patients with azoospermias, we need to categorize whether they are non-obstructive or obstructive. So in obstructive, you will see your epididymal head dilatation on a scrotal scan or an examination. So you would, or a block can be documented. When the hormone levels are normal and it's a non-obstructive azoospermia, then we can check for a Y chromosome microdeletion. It's not required in an obstructive azoospermia because their production is happening with only the out tract which is affected. So in them, anyway, it will come normal.
But why are we giving so much of importance for DNA fragmentation index these days? Because the test sounds it's quite expensive.
It is an expensive test, ma'am. The DNA fragmentation index is being concentrated now because more than it not causing pregnancy, it causes a lot of miscarriages. So in couples who are otherwise normal, who all the other reports are normal, this is one of the causes that causes high DNA fragmentation. DNA fragmentation basically causes early miscarriages. That is 6 to 8 weeks. So a lot of missed abortions are seen in these couples. So that is why we are checking for them. Again, we don't check it in everybody. In terms of infertility, we check it for people who have recurrent implantation failures, recurrent abortions, and severe male factors. That's where we generally check them. It's not done as a routine for everybody.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Hello.
Yes, ma'am.
A safe drug to improve the concentration and motility of the sperms.
First, we'll have to diagnose the hormonal assay for the husband. So, in patients with low count and low motility, if the FSH and LH is normal with low testosterone, we can give cyphene, that is clomiphene citrate, 25 milligrams for 3 months. So when the testosterone is low, this is the drug. When the testosterone is normal, that is your idiopathic low counts, the only antioxidant medications can help, but these again are not absolute in helping. So there's only one category of patients with low sperm counts and low concentration which can be helped are those with slight hypogonadism or low testosterone. So that is the only set of couples that are helped because clomiphene basically increases the endogenous testosterone rate, and because of which there is production of sperm that is resumed, and it increases the counts. So it has to be given for a minimum of 90 to 108 days for changes to be seen. But for that, an FSH, LH, estrogen, and a free testosterone value has to be done. So a free testosterone less than 5 or a total testosterone less than 400, you can be started on clomiphene. So this is a very safe drug and an effective drug provided the patient is selected properly. In men who have basically otherwise normal hormonal status and normal ultrasound with low counts, which is idiopathic, it is very difficult to treat them with medications. Their treatment of choice would be an IVF.
Thank you, ma'am. Madam, count is good, but motility is less. What to
Yes,
do?
ma'am.
Count is good, motility is less.
So the thing that we would have to assess in them is whether they have any. One is local temperature increase. So that could be seen in varicoses. That could be seen when they're working with the laptops on their laps. So temperature changes cause a lot of motility issues. Second is whether hormonal status is okay. And the third would be basically whether production itself is affected. So the main thing that we would have to look at is whether there is any varicocele or whether there is any temperature increase. The second thing that would we have to look at is lifestyle factors. Smoking also affects motility very much, and diabetes affects motility very much. So what we would have to look at in people with sperm counts and especially isolated asthenozoospermia is whether there is any lifestyle factors of smoking or environmental toxins that they're exposed to, and whether there is diabetes in these people. So correction of these factors usually leads to an improvement in the motility, provided the concentration and the normal forms are normal in this. If there is again idiopathic motility problems, then it's very difficult to correct. But it has to be remembered that the sperm production happens in waves every single day. So what is low motility today may not necessarily be so tomorrow because of the lifestyle changes that keep happening. So a diagnosis should be made with at least two different semen samples done about a month apart to diagnose that there is an issue.
Okay. Drugs, madam? Drugs.
Drugs basically for motility would be antioxidants, ma'am. Any of them available in the market would act the same way, especially coenzyme Q and zinc containing drugs.
Thank you.
Okay, so if there's no more questions, we would end this session for today. Please feel free to reach out to me directly if you have any further questions. And thank you for attending today's training program. And do stay tuned for tomorrow's advances in ART techniques. Thank you.
Thank you, madam. Hello. Hello.
Hello.